Most conflicts aren't lost when the fighting starts. They are lost in the quiet moments before a single word is spoken. You might feel the tension rising in a boardroom, a difficult conversation with a partner, or a high-stakes negotiation, and your instinct is likely to brace for impact. We are biologically wired to fight or flee, to meet force with force, or to retreat into safety. But over 2,500 years ago, a text emerged from the violent chaos of ancient China that suggested our biological instincts are almost always wrong. The text is known as The Art of War, and while it sits on the bookshelves of generals, CEOs, and Wall Street strategists, it is frequently the most misunderstood book in human history. We assume it is a manual on how to destroy an enemy. It is not. It is a psychological study on how to resolve conflict without ever destroying yourself in the process. This distinction is crucial because the advice sounds logical until you apply it to the real world. Most people read the famous quotes like "know your enemy" and treat them as slogans. But when you strip away the military language, you find a ruthless, uncomfortable guide to human nature that predicts exactly how people behave under pressure. The reality is that Sun Tzu, the supposed author, did not want to teach us how to wage war. He wanted to teach us that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting at all. To understand why this philosophy is so potent, you have to look at where it came from. The text was born during the Warring States period, an era of absolute fragmentation in China. It was a time when survival didn't depend on who had the biggest army, but on who possessed the sharpest intellect. If you made a mistake in strategy, you didn't just lose a deal, you lost your life. But here is the part most people miss when they study this history. Historians have debated for centuries whether Sun Tzu was even a real person. Some evidence suggests he was a general from the kingdom of Wu. Other scholars argue that Sun Tzu was a collective pseudonym used by a group of tactical masters who wanted to remain anonymous. And this ambiguity actually reinforces the first major lesson of the text. In high-level strategy, the identity of the messenger is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the efficacy of the method. Absolute truth is less important than practical results. This brings us to the first and perhaps most controversial pillar of his philosophy, the psychology of deception. There is a line in the text that many ethical people uncomfortable. All warfare is based on deception. When we hear this in the modern West, we interpret it as an instruction to lie, to be malicious, or to act without honor. But that interpretation is dangerous because it misses the psychological nuance. Sun Tzu wasn't telling you to become a liar. He was revealing a fundamental mechanism of how the human brain processes reality. Perception.
Reality. Whoever controls the perception of a situation controls the outcome of that situation. Think about a moment in your own life where the result depended less on the facts and more on what people believed about the facts. This happens in job interviews, in dating, and certainly in financial markets. The strategy of deception operates on three distinct levels. First, you must appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. Second, you create noise in one direction to distract from action in another. And third, and this is the most difficult, you must use your opponent's expectations against them. To see how this works in practice, we have to look at one of the most famous applications of this principle, often attributed to the strategies of this era. It is known as the empty fort strategy. Imagine a general, surrounded and outmatched. He has only a handful of soldiers inside a city, while an army of thousands approaches the gates. The logical, biological reaction is to panic, to barricade the doors, and to prepare for a slaughter. A conventional leader might try to hide his weakness, but a strategist trained in this philosophy does the exact opposite. In the historical account, the general orders the gates to be thrown wide open. He instructs his soldiers to hide. He then climbs to the top of the city wall, sits down in plain sight, and begins to calmly play a musical instrument. When the invading army arrives, they stop. They see the open gates, they see the lack of guards, and they see the enemy commander playing music without a care in the world. The invading general looks at this scene and his mind begins to race. He knows his opponent is intelligent. He knows that no sane person would open the gates unless they had a massive ambush waiting inside. The calm creates a cognitive dissonance. The invading general's brain fills in the gaps with fear. He assumes it is a trap. Terrified of an ambush that didn't exist, the invading army retreats. The general on the wall didn't win with arrows or soldiers. He won by leveraging the enemy's own imagination against them. This creates a terrifying realization for us today. The general on the wall understood that the battle wasn't happening on the field. It was happening inside the mind of his opponent. He knew that the human mind naturally creates patterns. We look for danger. We assume that if someone is calm, they must be safe. By manipulating that pattern, he controlled the enemy's reality. But this kind of psychological mastery is impossible without the second and much deeper pillar of the philosophy, self-knowledge. You have likely heard the maxim, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. It is printed on motivational posters in offices around the world. But familiarity breeds contempt, and because we have heard it so often, we stop thinking about what it actually demands of us. Sun Tzu wasn't talking about knowing your
favorite color or your management style. He was talking about a brutal, objective assessment of your own limitations. The data doesn't fail. Our interpretation does. Research into decision-making under pressure suggests that a vast majority of strategic failures, some studies suggest nearly 90%, occur not because the enemy was too strong, but because the leader overestimated their own capabilities. We tell ourselves stories. We ignore our weaknesses because they are painful to look at. We surround ourselves with people who agree with us. The text identifies that our greatest enemy is rarely the person sitting across the negotiation table. The greatest enemy is the version of yourself that is proud, the version that is fearful, or the version that is impatient. Consider the 5 dangerous faults of a leader outlined in the text. There is the reckless leader, who can be provoked into making a bad move. There is the coward, who can be paralyzed by the fear of losing. There is the quick-tempered, who can be manipulated by insults. There is the delicately honorable, who is easily shamed. And there is the compassionate, who worries too much about the immediate comfort of their team rather than the long-term survival of the mission. This is where the risk quietly increases. If you do not know which of these flaws you possess, your opponent will find it for you. If you are someone who needs to be right, a smart opponent will bait your ego to make you overextend. If you are someone who avoids conflict, a smart opponent will apply just enough pressure to make you fold early. There are no purely good or evil people in this strategic view. There are only interests and psychological levers. When you understand this, the world stops looking like a moral play and starts looking like a complex system of cause and effect. This leads us to the ultimate goal of the philosophy, the concept that separates a thug from a strategist, winning without fighting. The supreme excellence is to subdue the enemy's army without fighting. In our modern culture, we glorify the hustle. We glorify the grind, the conflict, the late-night arguments, the courtroom battles. We think that struggle is evidence of effort. But Sun Tzu would argue that if you find yourself in a fair fight, you have already made a strategic error. Direct conflict is expensive. It drains resources, it ruins relationships, and it creates resentment that fuels future enemies. True power does not lie in forcing others to do what you want through strength. True power lies in creating a situation where doing what you want is the best option available to them. It is a subtle difference, but it changes everything. When you force someone, you create resistance. When you engineer the situation so that their interests align with yours, you create a natural path forward. This requires you to look beneath the surface of the conflict. Most disputes are not about what people say they are about. They are rarely about the money or the specific terms of a contract. They are almost always about status, security, autonomy, or recognition. If you can identify the underlying need, the thing they are actually fighting for, you can often give it to them in a way that costs you nothing but grants you the victory you actually care about. But to execute this, you cannot be rigid. You must understand the physics of opportunity, which brings us to the concept of speed and fluidity. Sun Tzu wrote, "Speed is the essence of war," but he wasn't talking about rushing. There is a profound difference between speed and haste, and confusing the two is catastrophic. Haste is an emotional reaction. You act quickly because you are anxious to get it over with. Speed is a strategic capability. You act quickly because you have prepared, and you recognize that the window of opportunity is closing. Modern neuroscience supports this ancient distinction. We know that the brain has two systems of processing, a fast, intuitive system and a slow, analytical system. The master strategist does the slow, painful work of analysis beforehand so that when the crisis hits, they can rely on the fast system to execute without hesitation. When you move faster than your opponent can process, you create a phenomenon known as momentum. You are acting while they are still reacting. You are changing the reality on the ground while they are still trying to understand the report from yesterday. This cognitive gap is where victory lives. However, moving with speed requires you to navigate the environment you are in, not the environment you wish you were in. This is the principle of terrain. In the text, terrain is a metaphor for context. Sun Tzu outlines different types of ground: accessible ground, where anyone can move; entangling ground, where it is easy to advance but hard to retreat; and dead ground, where survival depends on fighting with desperation. In your life, terrain is the market conditions, the office culture, or the emotional state of your relationship. A strategy that works in a booming economy, accessible terrain, will destroy you in a recession, entangling ground. A conversation style that works with a supportive friend will backfire with a defensive boss. The mistake most people make is they have one way of doing things. They have a style. They say, "I'm a direct person," or "I'm a cautious person." But the text argues that having a fixed style is a weakness. You must be like water. Water has no constant shape. It adapts to the container. If the container is square, the water is square. If the container is round, the water is round. Water never tries to smash through a rock. It flows around it, over it, or patiently wears it down over centuries. But adaptability is terrifying. It requires you to let go of your ego and your comfortable habits. It requires you to abandon a plan that you spent months working on because the reality on the ground has changed. This is where the advice sounds
Right, but can still be dangerous if you don't have a specific type of leadership structure to support it. This introduces the problem of command. How do you remain flexible without creating chaos? How do you move fast without losing control? Sun Tzu's solution to this paradox was something called unity of command, but it came with a very specific caveat regarding authority. He famously stated that a general in the field must sometimes ignore the orders of the sovereign if those orders endanger the mission. This creates a tension that exists in every hierarchy today. The person at the top has the authority, but the person on the ground has the information. If the person at the top demands total obedience, the organization becomes slow and stupid. If the person on the ground has total freedom, the organization fractures. The bridge between these two is what modern military doctrine calls commander's intent. You don't tell people exactly what to do. You tell them exactly what needs to be achieved and why. When people understand the why, they can adapt the how to fit the changing circumstances without waiting for permission. This alignment allows for a type of decentralized speed that is impossible to stop. But even with speed, psychology, and flexibility, there are 5 fundamental factors that Sun Tzu claimed would mathematically determine the winner of any conflict. He didn't say you needed to be perfect in all of them. He said you needed to understand which one mattered most right now. The first is moral influence, the shared purpose that makes people willing to endure hardship for a goal. The second is weather, the timing and environmental forces you cannot control. The third is terrain, the spatial advantages. The fourth is command, the wisdom and sincerity of leadership. And the fifth is doctrine, the organization and logistics. The complexity lies in the fact that these variables are always shifting. In one quarter, logistics, doctrine, might be the deciding factor. In the next, it might be the morale of the team, moral influence. If you are optimizing for logistics when the problem is actually morale, you will lose, no matter how efficient you are. But beneath these 5 factors, there is a secret strategy that Sun Tzu barely whispered about. It is a concept so subtle that for centuries, many scholars missed it entirely. It is the idea of the victory that does not look like victory. We are conditioned to look for the dramatic win, the knockout punch, the hostile takeover, the public triumph. We want the applause. But the text suggests that the highest form of skill is to solve the problem before anyone even realized there was a problem. The greatest generals are not the ones with the most medals. They are the ones who prevented the war so skillfully that history forgot their names. They manipulated the alliances, adjusted the terrain, and shifted the psychology so that peace was the only logical outcome. This requires a suppression.
The ego that is almost superhuman. It asks you to trade glory for effectiveness. And this leads us to the most difficult question of all. If the best strategy is invisible and the best victory is bloodless, how do we actually practice this in a world that rewards noise and aggression? The answer requires us to look at the final and perhaps most spiritual dimension of the work, the emptiness of the mind. To the modern ear, emptiness sounds passive, perhaps even weak. We associate it with a lack of substance. But in the context of high-level strategy, emptiness is the state of maximum potential. It is the ability to clear your mind of preconceived notions, emotional triggers, and rigid plans so that you can reflect the situation exactly as it is, not as you wish it to be. This matters because the single greatest barrier to strategic clarity is emotion. Sun Tzu was explicitly clear about the dangers of acting on feelings. He wrote, "No ruler should put troops into the field merely to gratify his own spleen. No general should fight a battle simply out of pique." He understood that anger is temporary, but a destroyed kingdom, or a ruined career, or a shattered marriage is permanent. When we act out of anger, we are not responding to the strategic reality. We are responding to our own internal discomfort. We are trying to discharge pain, not solve a problem. This is where the risk quietly increases. In the heat of the moment, the angry response feels like strength. It feels like justice. But Sun Tzu warns that this is an illusion. An action taken to satisfy an emotion is almost always a strategic error because it makes you predictable. If your opponent knows that an insult will make you attack, they own you. If they know that a delay will make you impatient, they control your timeline. To reclaim control, you must value something that Sun Tzu placed above almost everything else: foreknowledge. The final chapter of the text is dedicated entirely to the use of spies. In ancient times, this meant sending agents behind enemy lines. But today, we should interpret spies as information channels. Sun Tzu wrote, "Foreknowledge cannot be gotten from ghosts and spirits, cannot be had by analogy, cannot be found out by calculation. It must be obtained from people who know the enemy's situation." This is a profound critique of how many of us make decisions today. We guess, we assume, we rely on ghosts and spirits, which is to say we rely on hope, luck, or our own intuition without validating it. We think we know what our customers want, what our partners are thinking, or what our competitors are planning, but we rarely do the hard work of actually finding out. In a modern context, the spy is the difficult conversation you are avoiding. It is the customer feedback you are ignoring because it contradicts your vision. It is the research you didn't do because you were too confident. Sun Tzu teaches us that investing in information is always cheaper than paying for ignorance. A dollar spent on understanding the landscape saves $1,000 spent on fighting the wrong battle. But here is the part most people miss about information. It isn't just about collecting data points. It's about understanding the potential energy of the situation. Sun Tzu called this shi. It is a concept often translated as strategic advantage or potential force, but a better metaphor is a log resting at the top of a hill. If a round log is placed on a steep hill, very little effort is required to move it. Gravity does the work. If a square log is placed on flat ground, immense effort is required to move it, and it stops the moment you stop pushing. The master strategist does not rely on their own energy. They rely on the energy of the situation. They position themselves like the round log on the hill. They wait for the moment when the market forces, the social trends, or the organizational momentum are already moving in their direction, and then they act. This explains why some people seem to achieve success effortlessly, while others struggle for every inch of progress. The struggler is trying to push a square log uphill. They are fighting against the shi of the moment. The strategist is identifying where the momentum already exists and positioning themselves to ride it.
This requires a shift in how we view challenges. Instead of asking, how can I overpower this obstacle? We should ask, how can I position myself so that this obstacle becomes an advantage? Consider the concept of turning the devious into the direct. Sun Tzu suggests that the longest way around is often the shortest way home. If the direct path is defended, or if the direct conversation will lead to a defensive argument, the wise strategist takes a detour. They build the relationship first. They solve a side problem. They create the conditions for success before they ever attempt the main objective. This patience is often mistaken for hesitation. But there is a massive difference between waiting because you are afraid and waiting because you are preparing. And this brings us to the ultimate danger of ignoring these lessons, the war of attrition. When we ignore strategy, when we act on impulse, without information, fighting against the momentum, we end up in a prolonged conflict. Sun Tzu was adamant. There is no instance of a country having benefited from prolonged warfare. Long campaigns drain the treasury. They exhaust the people. They blunt the weapons. In your life, this looks like the grudge that lasts for years. It looks like the project that drags on without a clear scope. It looks like the argument that goes in circles. Prolonged conflict is a sign of failed strategy. The goal is always a swift conclusion. If you must fight, you make it decisive and you end it. If you cannot end it quickly, you should question whether you should be in it at all. But as we reach the end of this analysis, we have to confront the reality of
applying this. It is easy to listen to these principles. It is incredibly difficult to live them. The world pushes us to be reactive. Our phones buzz with notifications demanding immediate attention. Our culture rewards the loud and the fast. To practice the art of war is to swim upstream against the current of modern life. It requires you to be silent when everyone else is shouting. It requires you to be still when everyone else is running. It requires you to retreat when your ego screams at you to advance. But if you can master these internal impulses, you unlock a kind of freedom that few people ever experience. You stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances. You stop looking for someone to blame when things go wrong. Instead, you look at the terrain. You look at the positioning. You look at the information flow. You realize that the outcome was not a matter of luck, it was a matter of strategy. The ultimate lesson of Sun Tzu is not about dominating others. It is about stewardship. It is about the responsible use of power. A true strategist knows that conflict is dangerous and costly, and therefore they have a moral obligation to resolve it as efficiently and peacefully as possible. They know that the greatest victory is the one that preserves, not the one that destroys. So, the next time you feel the temperature rising, the next time you feel the urge to lash out or the fear of an approaching conflict, pause. Remember the general sitting calmly on the open city wall. Remember that the battle is not out there, it is in your mind. Assess the terrain. Check your alliances. Verify your information. And then, act only when the victory is already won. You now have the framework. The map has been laid out in front of you. But a map is useless if you do not walk the path. The strategy is sound, but the execution is entirely up to you.